Our guest tonight has been here before, not too long ago, where he helped out explaining the neat stuff going on right now with the Atlas II program for WSO. He is the current director of the Western Great Lakes Bird and Bat Observatory. And if you're like me, you always wonder what that is and what they do. At the end of his presentation, we should have a much better idea of what goes on down there and what's been going on. It's some pretty neat stuff. Lots of surveys, lots of research is coming out here. He's current director. He's past conservation chair of WSO. He's currently working on the Atlas project and on the Wisconsin Bird Conservation Initiative. And I was talking to him earlier. I remember in 2013, I remember reading about this guy who was walking across the state for awareness, bird awareness of the plight of birds, and also raising money for research and for the Natural Resources Foundation. And it was Phil Miller, and he was having, we were talking about what a great experience it was. So he's not just talks the talk, he's out walking and doing things. He's a very active man. And I'm pleased to introduce Bill Miller.
Thanks, Jerry. I don't know. You tell me. People in the back hear me okay?
Yeah.
Oh, that's right. Okay, well, turn it up.
You ready?
Yes.
All right. I might need help from the back on this, because,
Okay.
yeah, need a couple in the back, please. It's the double switching, and it's always different every time, so that's why we always have to play with it.
Well, as Jerry alluded to, some people are probably thinking, what the heck is a bird observatory? I know what a regular observatory is, but what's a bird observatory? Do they peer through telescopes like the astronomers do? Well, of course we do that sometime, but around the world there are probably about 150 bird observatories. Some have been in existence for almost 100 years in some cases. Most of those are in Europe, and a great many of them are positioned somewhere on an ocean coastline. And for many, many decades, one of the main purposes of bird observatories is to study bird migration, and that's often why they locate them where they do. And this is no different. We positioned ours along the coast of Lake Michigan, and we're focusing some of our work there, but we do a lot of other things that take us away from home base on the coast of Lake Michigan. And so when Dr. Cutright had this germ of an idea, we tossed around some ideas, and he really wanted us to focus in the western Great Lakes region, and that's unfolding to be true. So bird observatories conduct bird banding, a lot of different monitoring projects. We certainly do that, but somewhat more than that as well. We started in 2010, but this idea is something that Noel Cutright had for some years. As he was coming up on retirement, he decided he would focus his energies on initiating this process, and he did. And I was fortunate enough to be chosen by him to lead it. As many of you who knew him know, he passed away a couple years ago, and something special is coming up in regard to Noel. He's about to be inducted into the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame on the 30th of April. I invite any of you or all of you to be there. I think it's going to be a special day. Noel really focused his entire professional career on bird conservation, science incorporating study of birds, but Noel wanted always, and I think he achieved this probably better than most people, to make research about birds be practical, make it applicable to serve the interest of bird conservation. And that's why he was involved in the first breeding bird atlas. He served as an advisor to literally dozens of federal and state agency groups and NGOs around the state and the region. and won a number of awards for doing that. He was one of those people, you could always get in touch with him very easily. He would answer your questions, serve on a committee. He didn't say no to too many people, and that worked in the opposite direction too. If Noel wanted you to do something, you know, he'd put his arm around your shoulder, kind of give you a little bit of a bear hug, and if you wanted to ask you to do something, you usually didn't walk away saying no. So when he said to me, "Do you want to work?" and I said, "Of course." And that has something to do with our name too. We're more than a bird observatory. We're the Western Great Lakes Bird and Bat Observatory. So there's a little wrinkle in there and a little story in there. One evening, Noel was talking to a gentleman who was going to provide Noel with some funding, and he said, "I'd be happy to donate, but I have a suggestion." And Noel said, "What's that?" He says, "I think you should study bats as well as birds." And it took Noel about 5 seconds to say yes. And then we were in the business of studying bats as well, which makes us a little different from most other bird observatories, although some certainly do work on other taxa besides just birds. Another unusual aspect of what we do is where we are. The Ozaukee Washington Land Trust, one of our main partners, bought a property a little southeast of the town of Belgium, a little north of the city of Port Washington, right along the Lake Michigan shoreline. Squire's Country Club, a golf course that was about to cease being a golf course. And the board of the land trust, you know, they were kind of scratched their heads because, you know, a few of us were very eager for them to do this, and they were wondering, well, what are we going to do with a golf course? We're in the business of, you know, shoring up and protecting natural areas as well as farmland, and this is a little bit outside of our wheelhouse. But eventually they were convinced to do that, and the Forest Beach Migratory Preserve now, about a block away from Lake Michigan, you can see a row of homes here in between us and the lake. We don't, except for a little narrow sliver, we don't extend all the way down to Lake Michigan itself. But because we're on the Lake Michigan Flyway, and because we've done $500,000 worth of ecological restoration, a couple of things that are accidental there, you know, I mean, the geography is right for us to get a lot of birds moving through during migration, but we've also created 10 different habitat types. A lot of times when you do ecological restoration, the goal is to create something akin to pre-settlement vegetation. You often hear those two words bandied about. That's not at all what we did there. If we had tried to do that, it would probably just be wet black ash and white cedar forest. That's probably what was there 250 years ago. Instead, we've actually created 10 different habitat types so that we can attract and provide arthropod biomass for the widest variety of migratory birds that move through both spring and fall. Has it worked? I would say it has, because in just 6 years, our property bird list is up to 245 species. And that's, I think, quite remarkable for a place that's less than 150 acres in size. We created 23 new wetlands on the site. They all have a water control structure on them so that the water level can be raised and lowered in spring and autumn to make a mud flat attractive to migratory shorebirds. And then during the summer, we let the water build back up again. At least a few species of aquatic birds use those as nesting sites during the summer. And then in late fall, we let them fill up again. I don't know if you remember November and early December. This was a really weird December we had this last December, and unusually kind of poor levels of snowfall, but a lot of rain. So all of those wetlands are in great shape now as they're opening up because they're full to the brim. And once we get to late April, we'll draw a number of them down, and they'll provide habitat for shorebirds. Man, that's a lot of words about one slide. Yes, sir?
Are they on the map?
You can see some of them. These little dark oblong shapes. And in many cases, the way they were set up is there is a berm on the lake side, and that's where the water control structure is. So the water control structure is not electronic or anything with a pump. It just works with a series of valves. Very simple. You just put a device in there and pull up plates within the water control structure, and then you can set the water level the way you want it to be. And the rest of the water just flows out. And when you want to fill it back in, you push those plates back in place, and rainfall or snowfall fills it back up again. So it's a great, simple system used by a lot of agencies and partners like Pheasants Forever and Ducks Unlimited for a pretty long time now. I mentioned the Land Trust. We could not exist without the Land Trust. Land Trust is our fiscal sponsor. We're on our way to becoming a 501c3 nonprofit, but while we're in the process, the Land Trust acts as our fiscal sponsor. So they handle all of our grant funds. They take a little fee for doing that, but it's very modest. And they're the owner of that property. We're just a tenant there, but we're pretty lucky because we have office space in that old country clubhouse. My office and library is actually in what used to be the pro shop. Doesn't look like a pro shop anymore, and the place doesn't look like a golf course anymore. So what are we? You know, you could put it into a few words. We're a research, education, and conservation advocacy organization focusing on both birds and bats. Our mission is to advance the knowledge of bird and bat populations and their conservation in the Western Great Lakes region and beyond. We focus on using good science, and as I mentioned, every day, you know, the ghost of Null is sitting right here whispering in my ear, and people often say, well, what does he say? And it's pretty simple. He just says, don't blow it. So now I'll tell you about some of our projects. A number of years ago, working on a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service grant, we built a database of records for the Lake Michigan shoreline, the entire arc, the western arc of Lake Michigan, all the way from the UP, all the way down, including all Wisconsin shoreline counties, northeastern Illinois, northern Indiana, so a long swath of land. We gathered data from about 80 different organizations, graduate student projects, faculty-driven projects, DNR projects, bird banding stations, sighting records, including eBird records, for the past 80 years. That database has now over 1.4 million records. The Fish and Wildlife Service is using that for a number of different purposes. Interesting thing about this, here's this arc that I was talking about. So our data kind of starts up here, goes all the way down there. Every one of those data points has a geographic connection, so all of that data is mapped. Now, I won't ask you to assume that all of my data points on this map number 1.4 million, because in some cases, one of those dots represents many, many thousands of records. But that's the geographic distribution of that database. One of our biggest projects for about the last 5 years is working on doing offshore, deep water surveys for waterfowl and water birds in Lake Michigan. For many decades, DNR and Fish and Wildlife did a near shore, and in some years they still do a near shore survey. By the terms of their insurance and regulations and the fact that they use a single engine aircraft, they're required to stay within a half a mile of the shoreline. When we were planning this, we thought, well, how are we going to get around that? And the simple solution was to use a twin engine aircraft. So if we're out 10 miles over the open waters of Lake Michigan and one engine dies, we won't die too. You know, every time when we go out to do one of these surveys, we use 2 observers, one sitting behind the pilot, one sitting to the right of the pilot. We always have a little safety in service. We put our inflatable life vests on, and we look at the location. Often it's next to me in the back seat of a big yellow plastic box that has an inflatable life raft in it. And we talk about, you know, the simple steps to inflate it. Obviously, you don't want to inflate it while you're in the cockpit. Would want to get it out the door first, you know. And then there's always about a minute of everybody just being real quiet, and then the pilot, often it's a gentleman who works for the Department of Natural Resources, Mike. He says that we're not going in the water, and we all nod our heads very eagerly in assent. So we got a grant. We started working on this back in about late 2009. We put together a Great Lakes open water research consortium of about 30 different partners from state agencies, federal agencies. It's a whole alphabet soup. Includes the Corps of Engineers, Fish and Wildlife Service, multiple departments of natural resources from all of the Great Lakes states, a number of different universities. And the emphasis behind all of this is the fact that we know that there's going to be wind power in the Great Lakes. It's coming. Is it 5 years in the future? Is it 10 years in the future? I won't attempt to make a prediction about that to you, but we know that it's coming. So we want to be ready. We want to be able to have a seat at the table when the wind developers begin to create the position of those offshore wind locations. And we want to be able to tell them the locations of the concentrations of waterfowl and water birds. So we put this together, and then we had a second round where we worked with a number of different agencies. Just this coming week, I'm going to give a presentation for the Great Lakes Commission at a Great Lakes Offshore Bird Workshop in Ann Arbor, Michigan. So we got a second grant, a Great Lakes Restoration Initiative grant. That money came to an end in about mid-2014. So right now, I'm looking for additional funding to do more surveys, because as I show you the maps that I have coming up here, I think you'll get the impression that there are a lot more questions that need answers. We're far from answering everything that we want to know. So you can see this dark blue line along the western shoreline of Lake Michigan from about northern Door County down to the Wisconsin-Illinois border. That's the area of our study. Our objective is to determine a more complete picture of both spatial and temporal distribution of waterfowl and water birds. What do I mean by water birds? Everything that's not a duck, goose, or a swan. So cormorants, gulls, loons and grebes, all those other aquatic birds that use the open waters of the lake. We focus a lot on Longtailed duck. It's a real important species in the Great Lakes. We can tell you more about that in a little while. So we use this twin-engine aircraft. We fly out of Whitman Field in Oshkosh and head over to Lake Michigan. We use this double observer protocol that I mentioned already, and we fly transects parallel to the north-south orientation of the lake. We conduct these transects north-south with a spacing that avoids double counting, and because we have this double observer protocol, the person on the left-hand side of the plane and the person on the right-hand side of the plane don't tell each other what they're seeing. So those observations are kept independent of one another. We fly at about 150 kilometers an hour, so about 100 miles an hour, and we're 100 meters above the water surface. I don't really like being closer to the water than that, and much higher, it gets it harder and harder and harder to identify birds from a plane that's moving at 100 miles an hour. So this is kind of the delineation of a survey block. In 2012, we added an additional transect, but first couple of years we did this, we started at 2 miles out, so we fly this kind of paperclip pattern. You know, we fly to the north end of the survey block, we move over, and we fly south. So we go back and forth, and we space these transects out so that we don't double count any individual birds or flocks of birds. We added that additional transect at only 1 mile distance from the shoreline because we realized that we were missing a certain component of the birds that were often in that zone, and you'll see that on some of my maps. So here are the locations of the survey blocks. They're all rectangular in shape. Back in the early days, we actually did a survey block that went all the way to the southern end of the lake. We stopped doing that after 2011, and we only went as far as the Illinois-Wisconsin border because one of our other partners is actually covering that area of the lake. So the time of each bird sighting is recorded. We use an onboard GPS to get an exact geographic location. We count the birds either singly or in groups. And when I say groups, wow, does that ever take up a tremendous broad range of numbers. Sometimes there'll be a little flock of longtails, maybe there's 5 or 6 birds, and then every once in a while we'll come across this massive raft of longtails that has 5,000 birds in it. So we're flying at 100 miles an hour, and we're 100 meters above the water, and I'm anticipating you're going to say to me, well, how do you count 5,000 birds when you're going 100 miles an hour? It takes practice, and it's not an exact count. If we get a really large number, sometimes we go back to check our estimate. Someday in the future, you can anticipate that surveys of this type will all be done with video and probably infrared, but we're not there yet. We don't record any observations in really rough water conditions. We try not to go out there when the winds are more than about 15, 18 knots because there's a lot of whitecaps then, which actually makes it difficult to distinguish birds from the surface of the water, and it's just not as safe. We record everything to the best level of identification possible. Now, that also, there's a little story there. Depending on the lighting, the angle of the sun, the direction you're going, you can see a flock of mergansers, and it's very difficult in some cases for even the most expert observer to say, okay, was that a female common merganser or was it a female red-breasted merganser? We often don't know, so we put merganser, species. Same with gulls. If you're 100 meters away from a gull, it's very difficult, especially when you're moving at that speed, to say whether it's a ring-billed gull or a herring gull. So in many cases, it's just gull, species. But any level of identification more than it's just a bird is a level of information greater than it's just a bird. So scaup, species tells you that it's not a long-tailed duck or any other waterfowl species, right? Merganser limits you to basically 2 because hooded mergansers are not found out in the deep water of Lake Michigan. And for the most part, we know from experience that scaup, especially in deeper waters, are generally likely to be greater scaup and not lesser scaup. That's not always true, but it's true more of the time than not. So you can kind of see where I'm going with this. Our sampling units, again, can be individual birds or groups of multiple size classes. I'm going to show you a number of different kinds of maps. I really like these. I did a lot of using of geography in my master's thesis and literally every kind of bird monitoring project for a number of years now. So I'm kind of a map geek. This is called a graduated circle map. Maybe some of you have seen maps like this before. Obviously, the larger the circle, the larger the number. So the biggest circles you see here represent 1,500 to 3,500 individuals of red-breasted mergansers during that time period, 2010 to 2011. So you can kind of see where those redbreasts are distributed, many of them offshore from Milwaukee, many of them between Ozaukee County and Sheboygan County, and then again, very large concentrations offshore from northern Manitowoc and Kewaunee counties, and somewhat lesser numbers offshore from Door County. So you'll get used to seeing a number of different kinds of maps like this. Longtailed duck, again, that's a big focus for us. Fantastic bird. It's got 3 plumages, breeds in the Arctic on shallow tundra ponds, and spends the cold part of the year in deep water. It's the deep diving champ of any bird. Even though you think of loons as being adept at diving, loons and many other waterfowl species often dive at depths of only 10 or 15 meters or less. Long-tailed ducks frequently, probably almost every day, dive to depths of 70 or 80 meters. And they use their wings while they dive. So they actually fly underwater. This is not something that most people are even used to thinking about. So it's an extraordinary organism. It's a benthic feeder, feeds on organisms on the bottom of the lake or the ocean. Globally, because this is a circumpolar species, it's distributed all around the northern hemisphere. It's globally in decline. It's still very important here in the Great Lakes. It's the focus of a lot of attention by kind of a specialized group of deep water waterfowl hunters. If you want to hunt long-tailed ducks, you have to be serious, because that usually means hunting 2, 3, 4, and even 5 miles offshore in November. You don't go out there with a rowboat. You got to have a big boat, big raft of decoys. It's very specialized hunting, and people who come here to hunt long-tailed ducks, they come here from all over North America. They consider Wisconsin's long-tailed duck hunt to be world-class. So we have a lot of these birds. You can see up in that northern block offshore from Sturgeon Bay and offshore from Kewaunee, we've had single-day counts of more than 40,000 long-tailed ducks in a single survey block on one day. So a lot of things going on with long-tailed ducks. Their preferred prey is a little tiny aquatic organism about the size of a grain of rice in the genus Dipperia. Dipperia has crashed in Lake Michigan compared to what it once was. Its population is probably only 15 to 18% of what it was even 50 years ago. So many of us are wondering, well, since that used to be the favored prey species for a long-tailed duck, what is it eating now? We do know that, like other diving ducks, they will exploit either of the invasive mussel species that we now have, the quagga and zebra mussels. Is that a good thing? You know, those mussels are very abundant, and it's a rich, fat-rich food source for diving ducks. Unfortunately, mussel species are often taking up a lot of contaminants. So over the long term, it's probably not a good thing for scaup or longtails to be feeding mostly on those invasive mussels. But it's just another piece of evidence about how the ecology of the Great Lakes is continually changing. 8 most abundant species just during that first 2-year period. Long-tailed duck. In this column you can see maximum count on the date, 25,555 on the 2nd of November. The percent of the total, 32,714, 47%. We find them between October and May. Red-breasted merganser 2nd, common goldeneye 3rd, Bufflehead, there's some strange things happening with buffleheads these days. We had a few incidents where we had large numbers of canvasbacks. That's not typical. We don't often have large numbers of canvasbacks in the Great Lakes, but we did that year. Bonapartes gull is listed here. If I could show you the data for 2013 and 2014, we had a fantastic spring with almost 8,000 Bonapartes gulls. We just hit the window of their migration perfectly, and they ballooned up to a large percentage of our overall totals. Greater scaup and then common merganser. These are, banders, codes for the remaining species that were found in much smaller numbers. Mallards, you don't expect to see mallards way off in deep water, but they're out there. Horned grebe, tundra swan, common loon, double-crested cormorant. Far more glaucous gulls than birders ever see from the shoreline. If you are out with me in a plane in February, I can show you many, many glaucous gulls lazing, taking a good, siesta out on a little ice floe 8 miles offshore. And there's many of them out there, and quite a few more Iceland gulls too. White-winged scoter, and then every once in a while we actually get a shorebird that flies across the lake and kind of takes us by surprise. So some more map examples. February 2012, and this focuses in on a smaller area offshore from Manitowoc and Sheboygan. You can see color-coded the 4 most common species that we often get. And on this and the next few maps, you're going to see bathymetry, in other words, the underwater profile of depth, because we're not only interested in how far offshore these individuals concentrate, but we'd like to know a few more things about why they're there, and we think that in many cases they're there because of underwater reefs and the existence of underwater profiles. Just like fishermen, you look for structure when you're going out fishing. Underwater structure, it's probably the same for diving waterfowl. So we're able to put together both this bathymetry, the darker blue is the deeper water. So you can see long-tailed duck is this light blue, red-breasted merganser, which doesn't even show up on here, is red, purple is common goldeneye, and then the tan are bufflehead. So a few more maps like that. This is a little bit further north. This is March of 2012. Again, those same 4 species. Start seeing long-tailed ducks in a typical winter moving north ahead of some other species. You can see long-tailed ducks form the bulk of what's displayed on this map. This is a little bit different array of maps. We actually look at density instead of raw numbers for this. So this is February, March, and April, just for long-tailed ducks. And you can see the highest densities are here offshore from Sheboygan and Manitowoc and Kewaunee. As we get into March, some of those birds are clustering further north, and we get into April, and a lot of them are gone by then. So the concentrations are constantly changing in relation to the timing of the season and prevailing weather conditions. Here are loons and grebes. We find them in smaller numbers. Here's February, virtually nothing there. March, we start to see a few. These are 3 species pooled. The data is all pooled. Then when we get into April, we start actually seeing some concentrations. So you kind of get a sense of where that group of birds is found as the season passes as well. Bonapartes gull, I mentioned, this is back in 2012. So you can see we color-coded these by month. So green was April. That's when the bulk of that species migration takes place on the Great Lakes. So I could bend your ear about deep water birds, and I actually give a lot of presentations on just that part of what we do. And now I'm going to move on to some other things that the observatory does. We work in partnership for a number of years with the University of Minnesota and the Fish and Wildlife Service. They constructed an array of acoustic monitoring devices all around the shoreline of Lake Michigan. So about 35 different stations where they placed an automatic recording device, and I managed a couple of those for them during the length of that project. It has a microphone to capture nocturnal bird calls and nocturnal bat sounds, which are not technically calls. And both of those types of sounds are recorded on that instrument automatically. It turns on at sunset, turns itself off at dawn, and then what we have to do is go in and change a data card and a battery every so often. Both of those organizations are still working on the data from that project. So that's just another example of a project that we've participated in. I mentioned at the beginning that one of the things that bird observatories really focus on strongly is observing migration from a single point. In Europe and the United Kingdom, you will often find the location of a bird observatory right on a headland that sticks out into the ocean, because that's often a traditional place where water birds and land birds pass during migration. Well, it's no different for us. We've got a great location just south of a rocky point in Harrington Beach State Park in Ozaukee County. Now, there is a lot of story involved in this as well. We've got one technician who mans that location 6 days a week, 6 hours a day, from March 1st to May 21st, and then again in the autumn he starts on September 1st, and he goes until November 21st. Mr. Brennan, our observer, is highly skilled. He's been doing this for a lot of years in a lot of different locations. And when people hear about the interesting birds, and especially the rather astounding numbers of birds that he sees, they often say, oh, I got to go down there and hang out with Kelvin and bring my scope and binoculars and see a little bit of what Kelvin's seeing. But you know how birders are nowadays. You know, we've all got a smartphone and we're in a hurry, and you know, we're checking our Facebook status while we're out there in the field. And like most people today, we're kind of under a lot of pressure to keep moving. So you often see people go and visit Kelvin, and they position their tripod and their scope, and they stand, you know, a few feet away from him, and Kelvin will be standing there. He's got 3 clipboards, and 3 mechanical counters, and a telescope, a pair of binoculars. And he's dressed for the weather because he's out there no matter what the weather is, from the worst to the best. And some days there's a tremendous movement of migratory birds, and Kelvin is kept busy manning his 3 mechanical counters and writing down everything that he tallies. And other times, it's dead. It's like the moon. You look out over Lake Michigan, and all you see is water. And so these birders, they're standing there, and they're kind of, you know, they kind of go to Kelvin, well, when is it going to start happening? The thing about Kelvin is he not only is an expert at identifying birds at a tremendous distance in flight, and then not only identifying them, but counting all of them, but he has the right temperament for this job. Because if it's boring, you still have to be there. And you have to stay there all day, even if it's boring. Because if you're not there all day, when something's happening, you'll miss it. And so, if birders want to share Kelvin's experience, they have to have some equal measure of patience to him. And I recommend that you go and visit him someday. because it's quite an experience. But Kelvin's numbers are quite amazing. In spring of last year, we had our highest count ever, 186,266 individual birds of 175 plus species. So that's not only waterfowl, water birds, gulls and terns, shorebirds, plus all of the land bird migrants that are passing his station. Now, he's on the shoreline, but the woods is right behind him. So Kelvin doesn't see a lot of what passes behind him because the trees are right there and there's only so far he can see. So he's really focused on 180 degrees east, or rather from south to east to north. That's in his vision, and that's what he's focused on. So he's watching for and specifically worrying about, you know, the numbers of waterfowl and water birds that pass by. Then, because he's an expert birder and he knows bird songs as well as anybody I've ever been in the field with, if there are small birds, warblers, sparrows and everything passing by, because he is standing on the shoreline, they're passing his position, so he's counting them as well. We're hoping that we're going to be in the business of doing this many, many decades into the future, because the way to really get meaningful data from a project like this is to do it over the long term. Another project that we're involved in, a number of years ago, we wrote a grant proposal to hire a coordinator for what is known as the Midwest Land Bird Migration Monitoring Network. This incorporates partners from all of the 8 states in what are called Fish and Wildlife Service Region 3, or the Midwest region, all the way from Ohio to Minnesota, from Michigan to Missouri. So we've got a lot of partners in that region. Some of them are relatively limited in scope. They do very small bird banding operation, or maybe they do some point counts. And then we've got partners like the Black Swamp Bird Observatory, who probably band on the order of 20,000 birds a year and run 100 nets. So from very, very small organizations up to very large organizations. We're managing to bring all of these disparate partners together, because one of our goals is to focus on making all of the protocols of all these monitoring projects as similar as possible, because we know that many monitoring projects for many, many years have had very different protocols, and the results of those projects therefore cannot be compared. So this has been a focus of ours for a long time, and it's a focus of the network. We got a grant from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to start pulling this together. One of the first things we did was hire our excellent partner, Dr. Amber Roth. At the time she came on board with us, she was working on the faculty of Michigan Technological University. Over this past fall, she's flown the nest, but she's still the coordinator for our network. She's now on the faculty of the University of Maine. At this point in time, I mentioned to Jerry and to Kent that this is going to be a little bit like church tonight, you know, where they pass the plate for 2 reasons. And I've got a bunch of donation envelopes. The observatory always needs money, but one of the main things that I came here to tell you about is Dr. Roth is beginning a new, really high-tech project to put geolocator tags on golden-winged warblers, which is one of her study species. Please think about your ability to participate in a really meaningful bird research project that's at the cutting edge of research and really greatly contributes to the conservation of a species of concern. So I'll just leave you with that and mention, yes?
Dr. Roth happened to be one of the presenters at the Coverts workshop that Larry and I attended last August. He might have mentioned this for forest land owners who want to manage their forests for wildlife, and we were just blown away. She's like 35 years old, or maybe even not that old, but just fantastic as a presenter, and I thought she'd make a great daughter-in-law, but of course she was already spoken for. But anyway, so she is really good. So she's working on a project. I encourage you to support it. We were very impressed with this young woman.
Just yesterday morning, Amber and I were talking about this, and I said I was coming to talk with you folks tonight, and I said that I would kind of spin the case for her and just put the word out to you to think about this. This project that she's starting, as I mentioned, is really on the cutting edge, and it's a project that we can get off the ground for a very modest amount. So really seriously, I'm asking you to think about supporting her research work. For a few $1,000s, we could make this happen, and it will help us to understand connectivity in that species of concern between its summer home, it's a globally important species, and about 60% of its global population lives spread between Minnesota and Wisconsin. So Wisconsin is really important to golden winged warbler. And then it goes to Central America during the cold part of the year. So to do effective conservation for birds like that, we really need to know a lot more about those connectivity questions.
Bill,
Yes.
I'd like to honor Noel Cutright by passing the hat. Noel had a habit of passing the hat for such projects like this. This is usually full of my head. Let's fill it with bills.
Are you in? No, I'm going to continue on. So, as I mentioned, there are donation envelopes for the observatory on the back table back there, plus some of our brochures. Maybe you'll be thinking about this 3 nights from now, and you'll say to yourself, well, I'd really like to support the work that Bill's organization does, and our address is on there, so I'm hoping you'll put more than a couple of quarters in one of those envelopes, and that's the end of my money part of the message. So, during the first year, 2014, Dr. Roth had a half-time position with us to pull together this network. We were funded again by a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service grant and to develop the network and to pull together a strategic action plan. That was her mandate for year 1 of that project. She did that. Here you see the cover of that document, which has been published and is available either as a hard copy or online. So this incorporates everything that the network is planning to do for its foreseeable future. It covers this 8-state area in the Midwest and Great Lakes region. And we now have about 80 different partners, either, as I mentioned, small banding operations to very large organizations working on other kinds of migratory bird research. In early 2015, our 2014 grant came to an end, so Amber and I went back to the well. We went to the Fish and Wildlife Service again, and we proposed an additional 2 years of work. We created this strategic plan. Now we need to actually implement. So we got another grant, a 2-year grant this time, to be able to do that, and we're kind of midway through that process now. Part of what we did was plan for 2 regional workshops for all these partners to gather and focus on this kind of work. We did the first one in October of 2015 at Forest Beach, our place in southeastern Wisconsin. The second one will be held as part of a much larger symposium that's going to take place this coming October in Milwaukee. This is the State of Stopover Symposium. This is going to have hundreds of researchers from all over North America who focus on stopover ecology of migratory birds. And our organization, our network, will host one of the 4 tracks of that research. 5th, 6th, and 7th of October, the State of Stockholder Symposium. The 16-member steering committee of the Migration Monitoring Network, our focus is really to enhance the survival of migratory birds throughout their whole annual cycle by really working on understanding migratory connectivity through this coordinated network of observers. You may have heard Mike Reese and I give you a talk this last autumn about the second Wisconsin Breeding Bird Atlas. Not going to spend too much time on this because I already gave this body a talk about this, but I'm going to kind of bring you up to date. Our organization has been involved at every level of the Atlas since the early planning days. We're one of the 4 primary sponsors. Null was a key member of the planning team, and he worked on planning and coordinating the Atlas up until about 3 days before he died. So, as I mentioned to you earlier, and Jerry and I were talking about one of the unique things about Null in the last 18 months of his life, he was increasingly weakened by liver cancer, and yet he went into work, even though he was retired, he went into his emeritus office 5 days a week, and he put in more hours of work than a lot of people that I know who are in their 40s. So it's really important for the observatory to continue the work that he started. I serve on 4 of the 6 Atlas committees. We have a big kickoff meeting for the 2nd year in a row, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of April in Wausau. If you're involved in the Atlas or thinking about getting involved, I highly recommend you attend that. Here's an image of the home page of the Breeding Bird Atlas. This is just one page on the WSO website. That's the home to a lot of information about the Atlas. If you've got any, kind of intricate questions about this, please stop and see me afterward. But here's just a kind of an infographic on the first year of the Atlas, which shows really how amazingly effective the first year has been. We have 700 plus observers in the field who surveyed 2,600 Atlas blocks just in that first year, contributed 23,900 checklists documenting 1.7 million birds. We confirmed 8 new species for the Atlas that were not confirmed during the first Atlas back in the 1990s. They're all listed here. The first Atlas documented 237 species of birds breeding in the state of Wisconsin. Just in year 1, we're already at 226 confirmed species. Does that mean we're going to confirm like 600 species? No. There probably any given year 230 to 240 species breeding in the state of Wisconsin. But what this means is we've got a great head start. This is a 5-year, $800,000 project. Hopefully by the end of it, we'll have maybe 2,000 observers contributing data. We've got 60 members on 6 committees organizing and running the show for the Atlas. So it's the largest citizen science project in the history of the state of Wisconsin, really contributing a lot of information about where birds are found, how numerous they are, and how much their concentration and their distribution has changed since Atlas 1. The message that I would leave you with, if you're interested in participating in year 2, maybe you're one of these really avid birders who's been working on the Breeding Bird Atlas, and you contributed a lot of data, entered your data into eBird. We call a block complete when you have achieved about 80% of the birds found during Atlas 1. So let's say your block has 100 confirmed species from Atlas 1 back in the 90s. So when you get to about 80 species in your block, this time around, you should say to yourself, my block is complete. Then what? Are you off the hook? You're done? No. What we would hope that you would do is move on to another block, because there are 1,300 and some priority blocks in the state of Wisconsin, and many blocks have no data whatsoever as yet. So again, if there's something about that that you're interested in, if that piques your interest, please see me afterward. So we've got a number of other smaller scale projects. I won't spend too much time on these. Like a lot of other bird observatories, we too have a banding station. Ours is still pretty small scale. We're focusing our banding at Forest Beach Migratory Preserve because, as I mentioned, it's kind of unique. It's had all of this ecological restoration done, and we'd like to be able to focus on how birds are faring at that stopover location, which is quite unique. Back in 2012, we got a state wildlife grant to work on a bat monitoring project. I, as part of that, traveled around the state and gave bat ecology talks to about 40 different groups, and we helped to pay for bat monitoring in hundreds of different locations around the state that year. The unfortunate, really sad news, since the end of that project, we know that we now have white nose syndrome in Wisconsin. And just as an aside, I've already been hearing from a lot of people this spring who are telling me that they're seeing bats flying around on warm days in March. That should not happen. We have 7 species of bats in Wisconsin. Half of those are migratory species that completely leave the state during the winter, like migratory birds, so they're completely gone from Wisconsin. The other half are hibernating species that spend the winter either in a cave or a mine somewhere within Wisconsin's boundaries. White nose syndrome is a fungal organism that attacks bats during hibernation. It's particularly bad for species that are in caves. When it was first discovered in New York State in 2006, researchers entering a cave that had what was ordinarily a number of about 1 million bats, 95% of those individuals were dead. So since 2006, about 10 years, we've already lost something on the order of 8 million bats in the eastern United States to this disease. It isn't really a disease, it's a fungal infection, and it affects bats' respiratory organs, and it also eats away at their wing membranes, so it causes a lot of damage. But one of the effects of it is it actually awakens hibernating bats. They start to stir, and then sometimes they fly out of the cave or the mine that they've been hibernating in. If you're a hibernating bat, you should not be coming out in January or February. Why? Well, obviously it's too cold, but most importantly, there ain't nothing to eat. So, if you see bats emerging at this time of year, all the hibernating species should not be emerging until about April, and all of the migratory species should not be entering Wisconsin until about April. Even on a very warm day.
Is it thought that global warming has something to do with it?
Climate change may be a factor in all of this, but I'm not sure how closely that's linked to this. White nose syndrome, we think, has appeared in North America. It's probably existed in Europe, possibly for more than a century, and it was probably brought here accidentally on the clothing and equipment of cavers. And since we started to learn about that, the Fish and Wildlife Service has been putting much stronger regulations on large caves and the entrance and egress of caving groups. They're required to treat their equipment and their clothing so that they're not carrying spores from an infected cave to another non-infected cave. And some caves are totally off limits to caving as a result now that have large bat populations. But one of the most recent little glimmer of hope is in some of those northeastern states that were a problem in the 2006, 2007, 2008 years. It seems to be that there are a few individuals that have recovered from that fungal organism and that are actually going back into those caves again. So there is some hope. Plus there is a tremendous amount of research being done on how to not only treat individual bats, but how to treat the caves and maybe eradicate that fungus. So we're far from an answer on that. You want more information about that? Again, please see me afterwards. During the summer, also of 2012, we asked cooperators to submit information to us on the locations of common nighthawks. Sure, every birder knows this species, but you may not be aware of the fact that common nighthawk is a species all over North America that's in quite dramatic decline. In the northeastern states, it's probably declined as much as 80%, along with chimney swift and some other aerial insectivores. All of the Canadian provinces have had a huge die-off of a number of aerial insectivores. Common nighthawk is only one, a few others. Even species that you thought of, if you've been birding some decades, you may think back, bank swallow. I think of that as a species with a C after its name for common. It might surprise you to learn that Manitoba and Saskatchewan have that species on their threatened species list now. The populations of those two species have declined by more than 75% just in the last 25 years. So nighthawk, whippoorwill, those two nightjar species, we have a lot of concern about them. Both of those species have declining populations. So we got a citizen-based monitoring grant to do collecting some data in 2012. We mapped all of that data. That was just the beginning. We actually participated with a student who is at UW Milwaukee who was doing her master's thesis on nighthawk distribution. Jana Veal has now gone on. She's in the first year of her PhD studying another group of aerial insectivores. Each year I do a very small scale pipe and plover survey in a kind of a unique location. I have a contract with NextEra Energy and I get to be shown through 4 levels of security at the nuclear power plant and go down and do my pipe and plover survey on their beach on Lake Michigan, which is off limits to everybody. And they're dead serious about it because it's a nuclear power plant. They have armed guards there and you can't walk on that beach. And I have to have an escort when I go there. So that's just one of the other small projects that we do. How many have I found? Very few, and no nesting individuals. We're another one of the organizations statewide that's involved in an American Kestrel nest box project. We manage data from about 175 kestrel nest boxes in about 7 counties. There's a great organization just south of you. Maybe those folks have actually been here before talking to you. Central Wisconsin Kestrel Research is another organization gathering data on kestrel nest boxes and how effective they are. Between us and them, we probably have about, we're gathering data from about 400 nest boxes over probably a 16 or 17 county area. But all that data goes to the Peregrine Fund for the American Kestrel Partnership, which is a nationwide project.
Bill, we fund that group.
Do you? Great.
We provide funding for this
Great.
Central Wisconsin.
That's a great organization. They do wonderful work. So, Jerry mentioned at the beginning when he was introducing me, we're involved in a lot of different outreach projects. I've been on the steering committee of the Wisconsin Bird Conservation Initiative since its inception back in 2003. I am co-chair of the Issues Committee, which is one of the standing committees at the WBCI. So that's a big focus for us. One of the things that the Issues Committee does is it publishes a series of white papers. They're called Issues Papers. They're all available online at the WBCI website. We have papers on a wide variety of conservation-related topics, including effects of pesticides on birds, climate change in birds, the effect of deer herbivory on birds, wind power in birds, window collisions in birds, and a number of others. So please go and check out the Wisconsin Bird Conservation Initiative website, and you can find all of our papers housed there. I'm also part of the Bird City Wisconsin Steering Committee. Bird City Wisconsin was something that was near and dear to Null. He was one of the founding members of that organization. My second in command at the observatory is Dr. Brian Lenz. He is the coordinator, the state coordinator for Bird City Wisconsin. I might just mention that a really wonderful event is coming up again in October of this year. In Wausau, we're going to hold the annual meeting of the Wisconsin Bird Conservation Initiative and Bird City over the course of a weekend, and it's shaping up to be one of the best bird conferences that I've ever been involved in. It's going to focus on conservation of birds and their relationship to the world of art. So stay tuned on that. That's going to be a great conference. I highly recommend you attend it. So if you've got questions, want to get in touch with me, you can easily ask Kent or Jerry in case you know this slide isn't going to stay up here forever. If you want to get a business card from me, please come and talk to me. Here's my email address, or you can get at us through our website, WGLBBO. It actually should say .org. That's a mistake. I have to correct that. And now I'll turn it over to you. If you've got questions.
I have one question, Bill. When you do the audio, I'm very interested in sound, the audio surveys that are being done. Are you using the software where the audio can automatically feed these night calls and songs into the software program that will pick out what it was? If you have people who know what all these flight calls are.
There's a couple different levels of things happening there. For bird songs, you have a new type of software called Raven, which actually is able to, you can play the recording through that software, and it will identify almost all of the bird songs with some exceptions. There are a few species whose calls are very similar to one another, and for those, we narrow them down to a species group. Sometimes it's a species pair. That's not too dissimilar from the information that we get on bat sounds. You use an acoustic monitoring device to collect data for bats. It can tell you, in many cases, about 5 or 6 species, and then the 6th or 7th species is part of a species pair, because their sounds are so similar to one another. If you don't have a perfect recording, you would not be able to separate them, and even an expert wouldn't be able to do it.
You know, it's been the cutting edge. And Bill, I mean, the people on the road for
Yes.
a lot of work.
Right?
Feel free to mingle and have some snacks and ask questions one-on-one with Bill. I just have to tell you, it's a good example of what one motivated and dedicated individual like Noel, like Bill, what can be done, what you can do, and I encourage you to support the conservatory, the observatory's work, and all these other people who are out there, and it's all their own time.